Jonathan Emord is a lawyer who has practiced constitutional and administrative law in Washington, D.C. for the past 27 years. He served as an attorney in the Reagan administration's Federal Communications Commission and as a vice president of the Cato Institute. He is the author of 5 critically acclaimed books, including his just released Restored Republic, with a foreword from Ron Paul. Jonathan has defeated the FDA more times in federal court than any other attorney in American history. 8 times. Ron Paul says that deserves an applause for sure. Ron Paul says all freedom-loving Americans are in debt to Jonathan Emord for his courtroom victories and calls Jonathan a hero of the health freedom revolution. George Nuri likewise calls him a knight in shining armor and says that we can thank our lucky stars we have people like Jonathan to fight for our rights. Excuse me. Jonathan lectures on law, is the author of a weekly column at newsreviews.com, and is the American Justice columnist for USA Today magazine. He is regularly consulted by the media on issues regulatory law and has appeared on the Fox Business News channel and the Christian Broadcasting Network in documentaries, films concerning the federal government, and of course on national radio with George Nuri, Coast to Coast AM, and the Jeff Rent Show. I'd like to welcome you to Jonathan W. Emord.
Well, thank you all for coming today. Exciting time discussing the machinations of the federal government. Yeah. All right. Could be. Well, we're going to discuss today the Food and Drug Administration, but we're also going to start with the background, which is necessary for us to understand completely why the Food and Drug Administration is such a renegade. You see, our government is in a state of decay, even as it becomes the most powerful institution in depriving people of civil and economic liberties. And that is because, with a national debt of $15.5 trillion, with the prospects by 2021 of having a national debt of $23 trillion, by 2021 we will be paying $700 billion in interest alone on that national debt. This massive parasite that is the federal government, that sucks the life's blood out of the private sector, is going to overregulate itself and tax itself into oblivion. And ironically, the founding fathers of this country anticipated this very course of events, which is quite extraordinary to learn. They understood that abuse of power and assumption of power would be something that we would have to fight against for the survival of our nation, for the survival of liberty in this country. And they realized that the limited federal republic that they created in the Constitution was always vulnerable to abuse of power by those who would substitute their will for the rule of law. And so Jefferson advocated a revolution every 20 years to bleed the tree of liberty to prevent this from happening. He thought that the concept of the Constitution, which declares the individual to be sovereign, which creates an environment in which the law protects the civil liberties of individuals, would erode over time and would be harmed by this pursuit endlessly by individuals of their own self-interest at the expense of the public. But Madison and Hamilton and others all took the position that frequent elections could prevent this. But they understood the nature of man. As we see here, John Adams' defense of the Constitution of the United States all men are inclinable to act according to their own wills and interests in making, expounding, and executing laws to the prejudice of the people's liberty and security. Hello?
Can I say something about that?
No, no, you can't. We have to continue, but you can shortly. The source of legitimacy for the United States government. The United States government, as conceived in the Constitution, is predicated on the consent of the government. And the basic principle of agency applies. Non-delegable power is entrusted to the specific constitutional departments. This is very important. The constitutional departments, the legislature, was delegated the exclusive power to make law, as was the executive the exclusive power to implement the law, and then the judiciary the exclusive power to judge the law. And the redelegation of those powers to the 250 independent regulatory commissions is an extra-constitutional act, and one that was fraught with risk of disaster as far as the Founding Fathers were concerned, precisely because of the essential need for the government to be based on the consent of the government. As soon as those we elect are no longer responsible for the laws, the consent of the governed, which is underpins a just government, is completely eliminated. And then protection of unalienable rights. These are the essential principles for the American government. The basis of our political system is the right of the people to make and to alter their constitutions of government. But the Constitution, which at any time exists, till changed by an explicit and authentic act of the whole people, is sacredly obligatory upon all. The very idea of the power and the right of the people to establish government presupposes the duty of every individual to obey the established government. George Washington's farewell address. You see, the consent of the government and the need for an explicit change through Article 5, the amendment process, to make any change in the system is absolutely indispensable to ensuring that you remain sovereign. When individuals in government alter the context of the Constitution by their actions, exceeding the power that is created in the Constitution for a department, delegating that power outside of the department into the hands of the unelected bureaucrats who then create law, enforce law, and judge law. When this sort of thing happens, it is a direct assault on your sovereignty because it destroys the consensual basis for the government and puts us in a position where there's this dissonance, increasingly so, and now enormous in modern government, between a legitimate government based on the consent of the governed and a government that is solely based on the will of those in power, where their arbitrary will becomes the law, and where they can enforce it one day differently than they enforced it another day, and where they don't adhere to the Constitution, but impose this power limitation upon all of us. We are restricted in our freedom to take action, based primarily on the actions of the unelected heads of the bureaucratic agencies, not upon the actions of those we elect. When we put someone out of office, it has virtually no effect because the bulk of law and enforcement of law, 9/10 of all law, is the product not of those we elect, but of the unelected heads of the bureaucratic agencies. We're going to use the FDA as an example. But then we have George Washington again in his farewell address, preaching, telling future generations, look, be mindful of this dissonance that can be created. Be mindful of the need to trust in the people to amend the Constitution and change it, to not allow this constitutional amendment to occur at the will of those in power without regard to the Constitution. Don't make the Constitution a mere parchment barrier, were the words of James Madison. If in the opinion of the people the distribution or modification of the constitutional powers be in any particular wrong, let it be corrected by an amendment in the way which the Constitution designates. But let there be no change by usurpation. For though in one instance it may be an instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. Everything government does is shrouded in a public interest veneer. There's always a sales pitch for it. Behind the scenes, the activity that causes the legislation to arise is principally driven by those who have the greatest at stake, which oftentimes are the corporate people who have an interest in preventing competition. And they push for legislation, allegedly for the public interest, when it really will create barriers to market entry, and create anti-competitive benefits for them. And this is the typical way in which modern law is created. So in the 1930s to the present, we have this destruction of the non-delegation, separation of powers, and enumerated powers principles, among others. The key doctrines and provisions of the Constitution designed to limit federal power to ensure sovereignty of the individual, so that the government was responsive and was representative of our interests, and so that the government may remain beholden to us in taking action, and enabled us to vote people out of office if they took actions we did not like. Keeping us in the position of being sovereign is gone. We are no longer the sovereigns in this system. Those who run these agencies are sovereign. They rule like absolute monarchs. They determine what the law will be, and they don't hear from us. They don't solicit our opinions. They don't care to know what we have to say. We are irrelevant to the creation of 9/10 of all laws by this federal government. It is a shocking change that would have been absolutely unacceptable to the Founding Fathers. Indeed, they fought a revolution against this type of thing. It was precisely because the British Empire was not comprised of representatives of the colonists in Parliament that we revolted against Great Britain. That actions were taken in violation of our civil liberties, the quartering of troops on our soil, the imposition of taxes without our consent, the trial of our people in foreign lands, the trial of our people under a system of jurisprudence they did not approve, the closing of state legislatures, all by an absolute monarch, without any say-so of the colonists, and without their ability to have any representation in Parliament. And so it was then that we had the cry, no taxation without representation, which is equally applicable today. We are taxed without the ability to have representation on the principal uses of the money that comes from us to fund the federal government. So we have a switch in time that saved nine, the 1930s. Struggling with the Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt decided on a grandiose plan. And that plan was to use the instrumentalities of the federal government in an unprecedented way, to cause the federal government to take over the marketplace, to structure wages and prices, and to structure the units that could be produced, and the distribution of resources in the economy through the National Recovery Administration, to do things that were wholly unprecedented and for which there was no constitutional foundation. In the initial period, these actions were held unconstitutional by the federal courts and by the Supreme Court, holding them to be unconstitutional delegations of power, in violation of the non-delegation doctrine, holding them to be a violation of the separation of powers. And yet, despite these constitutional precedents, the law changed. How did it change? Franklin Delano Roosevelt, through his Attorney General Homer Cummings, introduced a bill to pack the court, to put for every justice then sitting, who was 70 years and a half of age, a new justice, to water down the court, to fill it with all the New Deal advocates. This so shocked the court when this bill was pending that it caused what the journalists of the day called the switch in time that saved nine, causing these jurists to fundamentally shift their approach to the law. Some resigned, like Justice Van de Vanner, and others changed their position, so that within a few years of this proposal, the Supreme Court was no longer holding things a violation of economic liberty, no longer holding things to be a violation of the non-delegation doctrine, no longer holding things to be a violation of the separation of powers doctrine, and upholding law after law after law that delegated massive amounts of power out of the hands of elected representatives into the hands of authoritarians who run the independent regulatory commissions. This movement continues all the way to the present with 250 independent regulatory commissions now governing the United States. We have been transformed from a limited federal republic into an unlimited bureaucratic oligarchy. There's no provision in any regulation that you can cite by the federal government that provides safeguards against the violation of individual liberties to economic liberties and civil liberties. None. No provisions for even safeguards to protect against it. There is no system of jurisprudence that protects the people whose rights have been violated. You can't even get into the federal court system to have an independent decision in most instances. So it is that we have been transformed. The preamble to the Constitution, we the people of the United States do ordain and establish this Constitution. No mistake that it commences with we the people. The notion of the Constitution is rooted in sovereignty. The supreme power resides in the people. Those who ordain and establish have the power, if they think proper, to repeal and annul. James Wilson, in convincing those to support the Constitution in the Pennsylvania Ratifying Convention and throughout the colonies, the argument was consistently made, hey look, don't fear this Constitution. It arises from the people. It vests sovereignty in the individual. We're not going to see a radical transformation of power here. And so it was. Corruption. Corruption everywhere. You see, they understood fundamentally that when you give people power, they will use those powers in their own self-interest. Give them a little bit of power, they'll still abuse it. Give them just a wee bit, and they'll pervert it to their own self-interest. To get a job after they leave government, to ensure that they feather their own nests, to get their family members positions of importance, to use that influence to curry favor with other politicians to help family members and so forth. Every politician virtually, except for Ron Paul, has used this power to feather their own nests. And they understood this to be the case, the Founding Fathers. And so, as the government has grown to the extent that now it is the ratio of GDP to the national debt is 100, excuse me, the other way around, it's 100.4%. The United States government's national debt is in excess of all of the wealth generated by the productive people in the United States combined. And we have massive corruption. Virtually no week goes by when you don't hear a story about corruption in an administrative agency, in the Congress of the United States, in the executive branch. Almost impossible for us to exist for a 72-hour period without some new horror story about abuse of power. And that is because instead of an ounce of power, they have gallons of it, and they're swirling in it, and they love it, and they use it for their own self-interest at our expense. We are paying for our enslavement. We are helping them forge the chains. We are helping them apply them to our wrists and our ankles. We are helping them drag us through the dirt. We are tolerating the destruction of our own sovereignty. As our sovereignty is diminished and as their sovereignty increases, we experience this enslavement. Now let's talk about the FDA. Let's talk about a very interesting example of Health and Human Services. There's our good friend George Bush. There's our good friend Billy Tauzin. Kidding. George Bush, Billy Tauzin, and Medicare Part D. This is a sad story. Medicare Part D is the prescription drug benefit for all seniors in the country. George Bush, to get reelected, used that as one of his vehicles to gain support. He said, I'm going to create a welfare benefit for every senior citizen in the United States. Every senior citizen in the United States is going to have the benefit of free drugs. Free drugs, great. Free drugs. And that was a lovely selling thing. Coming from someone who said he was a mirror image of Ronald Reagan. Not. So he offers this program. Now this gentleman right here to our right, Billy Tauzin, was a Democrat for many years, but suddenly decided that he would change his stripes and become a Republican. No problem. Ideology doesn't mean much to him. So he shifted from Democrat to Republican. Now, when he became a Republican, he made it possible for himself to become the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House, which has supervision over Health and Human Services and is the key position for introduction of any bill that is going to affect that. So the Medicare Part D bill goes to Billy Tauzin. Now he's given an assignment by the White House, and among the assignments, in addition to getting the bill passed, was one additional one, and that is to prevent the negotiation of prescription drug prices by the federal government with the drug industry. To include a provision that would prevent the United States from negotiating down the per unit price of drugs sold by the drug industry, turning over the keys of the United States Treasury to the largest state-sponsored monopolies in the world, to draw out of the Treasury any amount they want just based on the per unit price of a drug. The Veterans Administration has negotiation of prices on drugs. The military has negotiation on the price of drugs. But the largest welfare program for the drug industry in the world has an absolute prohibition on it. They determine what the Treasury will pay them. thanks to Billy Tausen's action. Now, let's fast forward a little bit. And then we have Obama stepping in. Lest you think I'm partisan in attacking George Bush, I'll help you understand a little bit about Obama. Obama, during the campaign, made a number of pledges, one of which was, in a campaign commercial called Billy, and in the campaign commercial called Billy, he pointed out, rightfully so, that Billy Tausen was a bad actor, that he had done this to the American consumer on behalf of the Bush administration, making the per unit price of drugs not subject to negotiation down, hurting the American taxpayer. And then in addition, right after he did this, he bolted to the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers Association, becoming their executive director and being paid $2.5 million a year. As a thank you for his extraordinary effort, which will give the drug industry trillions and trillions of dollars, indefinitely. And so, Obama, as candidate Obama, rightfully attacked the administration for that and made Billy a centerpiece of the campaign. And at the end of the commercial, Obama says, "This game playing in Washington has to come to an end, and if I'm elected president, it will not occur." Well, what happened? Well, as I explained in Restore the Republic, the paybacks continue. As the president fights for an atrocious new national program, the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, he wants to elicit the support of the drug industry to get their lobbyists to put pressure on Capitol Hill to ensure the passage of his bill. So he has already declared in his campaign commercials and throughout the nation that Billy is persona non grata. He's an enemy of the Republic. He's done something horrible, even some would say treasonous, selling out the United States for the financial interests of the drug industry, only then to be complimented himself personally financially by that same industry after he did that dastardly deed. But Obama invites Billy to the White House. And so much for the notion that the White House won't be lobbied. He invites him to the White House again and again and again and again, all to discuss this bill. And on Billy's side, he's telling the president, the drug industry will help you, Mr. President, but only if you break your promise. Only if you leave alone that provision which prevents the negotiation of the prescription drug prices. Furthermore, Mr. President, we won't help you unless you agree to do something else that you said you wouldn't do, which is this re-importation of drugs from overseas that are sold by the drug industry in the United States at a higher price than they're sold overseas. You can't do that. You have to work against that, or else we won't support you. And the president says, okay. And the White House writes a memo. And in the memo, they make this commitment to break their promises, to ensure that the drug industry is in favor of this move for the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. So much for a key promise. Now, back here again. So, Margaret Emord's protection of drug and medical device industry profiteering. Let's talk about that. Just a few examples. GlaxoSmithKline's Avandia drug is a good case in point. Avandia is a drug for type 2 diabetes. Avandia is a GlaxoSmithKline drug. Avandia, at the time they submitted the drug application to the FDA, was known to increase the risk of heart attack and stroke. But the industry suppressed most of the information related to that at the time they made the submission to the Food and Drug Administration. During the course of the FDA's approval and the marketing of Avandia, there are these adverse events that start pouring in. One of which was from Diane Watson, who was a congresswoman from California. She went to her doctor and was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. Her doctor then prescribed Avandia. She took the Avandia for a little while, and then she noticed that she had heart palpitations. She went into the doctor, and he recommended her to a cardiologist. The cardiologist investigated the heart and determined that for the first time in her life, although she had a magnificently healthy heart, she now has a heart murmur, and that it's serious. She goes back to her doctor, and he says, Congressman Watson, I'm afraid to have to report to you that I've given out many prescriptions for this drug, and heart ailments are occurring, and I believe that your heart ailment is a direct result of you taking this drug. And I'm mortified by it. That's what I think happened. And he tells her to discontinue taking the drug. She's on the Energy and Commerce Committee. The Energy and Commerce Committee then takes up the issue of whether GlaxoSmithKline is suppressing information about Avandia and whether Avandia is unsafe and should be removed from the market. They bring in the executives from GlaxoSmithKline. They look at all the correspondence. They find this correspondence between top people in GlaxoSmithKline and the Commissioner's office at the FDA, where it's apparent that GlaxoSmithKline is being given inside information about the FDA's own medical reviewers reviewing the drugs, and how GlaxoSmithKline is telling the FDA, we don't want this reviewer looking at that drug. This reviewer might say something negative about that drug. And the response is coming back from the FDA that we can reassign that to someone else. We can assist in making sure that this goes through. All of this horrendous correspondence that is reported upon in the congressional record. So one would think, based on all of this and the proof that came to light during the hearings, which was that indeed there was a link between Avandia and heart ailments, including peer-reviewed scientific journal articles associated with it, that this would be removed from the market. And we have the Obama administration's commissioner of the FDA, Margaret Hamburg, who calls a review panel together, a drug review panel, to consider what to do with Avandia. Of course, she selects the people on the panel, and she waives their conflicts of interest. She selects people with interests in supporting GlaxoSmithKline's position, and she affirmatively waives the conflicts in order to form this panel. Well, the panel finds that there's heart toxicity, but its recommendation is that the FDA not remove the drug from the market. They can't but admit that the evidence is overwhelming of the existence of heart toxicity, but they talk about the type 2 diabetes benefits that come from this drug, and they say that compared to a heart attack, reducing your blood sugar levels this way is better. So the FDA commissioner takes this information, and what does she do? Tremendous pressure is put upon her from medical groups, from scientific groups, from the Congress of the United States, from within the FDA. FDA Associate Director of the Office of Drug Safety, David Graham, says this is a horrendous drug. It has to be removed from the market. There are comparable drugs that are available for type 2 diabetes that don't have this risk profile. And she makes her decision. She doesn't remove the drug from the market. She says that it may continue to be marketed and prescribed to those who currently use it, the very ones at the highest risk of heart attack and stroke and other adverse cardiac events. And what happens to this commissioner, who has taken a step now that will ensure that people who are at risk of these events and suffer them and may even die from them, what happens to this commissioner? Nothing. Nothing. So the FDA guidance on mobile medical apps comes out. This is another area entirely. Mobile medical apps are fantastic things. For the first time in history, because of the innovation in IT companies, it's possible for doctors to take care of their patients at remote locations. Let's say you have a chronic ailment. Let's say you always have to go to the hospital for treatment of that ailment. You may be given a supply of drugs. You may be at home. You may have a computerized device that delivers those drugs, and your doctor may use his BlackBerry, his iPhone, his iPad to communicate information to the computers that will determine the dose and prevent you from having to come in, physically go through this whole process. At the same time, you can have monitors throughout your body determining heart rate, blood pressure, etc. And on the screen, on his iPad, he gets all this information about you and has that 24 hours a day and can monitor your health and can determine, and this is an extraordinary breakthrough that can ensure that people can be cared for who are critically ill 24 hours a day in ways that were never possible before this, the advent of this. Many people who would die simply because they're on their way to the doctor can now be treated without the necessity of going to the hospital. Absolutely phenomenal. And these mobile medical apps started to proliferate, popping up all over the place. Some of them just giving information, others having this interactive methodology. One doctor at the Cleveland Clinic, Dr. Martin Winehouse, created this mobile medical app that would take all of the parameters used in creating a calculation for the delivery of radiation to a tumor cell. Not a big fan of this treatment, but nevertheless, to a tumor cell and save the healthy tissue. When done manually, the computations are frequently in error, and they take over a half an hour for the doctors to do them. They frequently have to do them over again. And the delivery of radiation is frequently either too much or too little, and oftentimes would affect healthy tissue. So this was an extraordinary breakthrough by this medical physicist at the Cleveland Clinic. He suddenly finds out that he has to go to the FDA to get approval. The FDA has taken the position that these mobile medical apps are illegal unless the FDA pre-approves them as medical devices. So begrudgingly, he agrees to go through this process. He submits the application to the FDA after months of preparing it with all of these brilliant physicists and so forth contributing to the production of this document. Goes to the FDA, and the FDA starts asking questions. They ask the question, one of the questions is impossible to answer. They ask him, can he guarantee that regardless of the evolution of the computer devices that are used in the future and the potential changes in software, that this device that he has created, this software, would continue to have the same reliability and would continue to function with the same high degree of effectiveness as it does right now? And he contacts the FDA and said, I can't answer that question. I can't predict the future. I can't even predict next week. Computer programs and software change weekly, monthly. You can't ask that question of anyone. We'd never have any medical device approved. You must answer it. He said, to give you something that approaches an answer to that question, I'd have to have all of these staff people working full-time for over a year. We give you the information, it'll already be obsolete. This works now. We're doctors. We know our profession. We know if it's accurate or inaccurate. When we look at the readings, we know whether it meets with software that we're using or not. We use the software all the time. Nope. If you don't give us that information, we can't approve the device. So what does he do? Can't afford to go through the process. Can't give them the answer that they want. He has to abandon the application. This innovation has never come to the market. No hospital in the United States can use it. Women are still being overdosed and underdosed, precisely because the FDA stands in the way. This is one example. I could give you dozens of similar examples. Why did the FDA do this? Because they're protecting the FDA-approved medical devices from competition. They're protecting the existing incumbent licensees, the people they've given grants to, from any new source of competition. They're Johnny-come-lately on this. They were shocked by the proliferation of mobile medical apps. They quickly assumed their jurisdiction over it, which is questionable. And then they enforced it, and then they insist that if you don't follow through by submitting the applications, which more times than not will be denied, resulting in a loss of that innovation, improved medicine, that you will be prosecuted. So the FDA's destruction of the dietary supplement industry. Let's shift to that industry. So now we have a picture of how the government works. There's a tremendous degree of corruption. As I've explained many times in the past, many FDA whistleblowers who are medical reviewers have testified before Congress that this agency protects its drug licensees and its principal medical device licensees and the primary food manufacturers in the United States against competition. We've seen that with numerous drugs. We saw that with, for example, Vioxx, which we've discussed. How the FDA commissioner kept Vioxx on the market, even though the adverse event reports were pouring in of it causing heart attack. There were 140,000 heart attacks caused by Vioxx. There were over 60,000 deaths from those heart attacks. And yet, even with that information before the FDA, Lester Crawford, the FDA commissioner, and had assembled before him the FDA medical reviewers, they were demanding that the drug be taken off the market. 2 weeks after this event that I'm talking about, Merck withdrew the drug on its own from the market against an avalanche of products liability suits. The evidence was there, and what did the FDA commissioner do? He said, well, there are a lot of adverse event reports, but adverse event reports are all anecdotal. There's no scientific proof there. And furthermore, I think this is a good drug, and I'm going to approve it today of my own accord for use in pediatric rheumatoid arthritis patients, for use in children. Yep, for use in children. This thing that is causing adults to have heart attacks and strokes all across the country, with publications in JAMA and in The Lancet showing this direct connection between this drug and these toxic heart effects. He approves it for use in pediatric rheumatoid arthritis patients. And then there's Ketec, which we'll quickly discuss. Ketec is a Sanofi Aventis antibiotic drug, a super antibiotic, which was designed by Ketec, by Sanofi Aventis, allegedly under the most extraordinary circumstances with clinical trial results that made it seem too good to be true, and indeed it was too good to be true. the medical reviewers at FDA found the principal clinical trial upon which Keytech was based had been made up. There were no people enrolled in the clinical trial. There was no clinical trial. They made up the data. And the FBI investigated them and found this fraud to exist. And one would think, as the medical reviewers at the FDA certainly thought, that the commissioner now has to deny this drug. It's a fraud. And yet, despite that evidence, the FDA commissioner approved Keytech into the market and even approved for the labeling of the drug, labeling that came out of the fraudulent clinical trial. So when it comes to dietary supplements, the FDA has had this historic bias against supplements. Why? Because there's this monopoly that is created in the law and that the FDA preserves for the ability of the drug industry to communicate therapeutic information. If you have an FDA-approved drug, you're given a license to communicate therapeutic information about that drug. But if you're not an FDA-approved drug, if you're a food or you're a dietary supplement, and you have therapeutic effects, and you can even prove to a near conclusive degree the existence of those effects, it is absolutely against the law through a total prior restraint for you to be able to communicate to the public such a simple thing as prune juice treats chronic constipation. Put that on the label of a prune juice bottle, and you've just committed a felony. You'll be prosecuted for the sale of an unapproved drug. All your prune juice will be seized from the market, and you'll be thrown in jail. If you say anything that is not approved by the FDA about a food or a dietary ingredient that concerns a beneficial health effect that has an effect on disease, it is illegal in this country. So much for freedom of speech. So there is this historic bias to protect the monopoly of the drug industry to communicate therapeutic information. The FDA GMP regulations. Now this is very interesting. Here the leading figures in the industry, the Natural Products Association, formerly the Natural Nutritional Foods Association, these companies become convinced by their lawyers and think this is a good idea that they go to the FDA and they advocate extensive regulation from the source ingredient to the finished product by the FDA, that they'll get rid of all of this public angst about dietary supplements that's generated in the media, and they'll curry favor with the agency, and that will redound to their benefit. But most importantly of all, they thought we, the big guys in this industry, who are small compared to the drug companies, are going to have this relationship like the drug industry. And they're going to like the big guys, and they're going to protect us because we're going in volitionally for this regulation. And all our competitors out there are going to be destroyed because the small guys won't be able to afford the cost of cradle-to-grave regulatory compliance. They won't be able to afford the cost of complying with all these written reports and quality control managers and repeated inspections. It just won't be possible for them. It'll drive them out of existence. We'll be left with a lion's share of the marketplace. But as I told them then, and as actually came to pass, I said, you don't understand. The drug industry is the elephant that the FDA rides, blind, letting the elephant go wherever it wants. You're like a flea on the back of that elephant. If the elephant isn't bothered by you, you can go along just fine. If you create an irritation to its flesh, the elephant won't be able to get rid of you, but the FDA will very quickly take that riding crop and smack you with it and reduce you in your significance. What you are doing is based on an erroneous assumption that you are as powerful as the drug industry. This will be perverted to your disadvantage, not just to the elimination of the small guys that you want, which is reprehensible, but also to your own elimination. So you're committing suicide by doing this. But they say, oh, no, we know what we're doing. We have this tremendous influence. The FDA said they like what we're proposing. And so they go in and they buy themselves a ticket to die. And the FDA adopts it. And then the FDA begins doing it. And all of a sudden, these people who are supportive of this, they say, oh, this is terrible. We didn't go in for this. No, go to the guy down the street. We have a big plant. We have all these wonderful machines. They're brand new. We pay a fortune for lawyers and other people. The guy down the street is mixing it in his basement. And they smile and say, we'll get to the guy down the street. But today is your day. And so they go through and they cite all these companies and they create this public brouhaha about how they're making unsafe supplements, and it goes on and on, hurting the industry. And then the GMPs weren't quite enough, so they come up with this new dietary ingredient guidance. And what this new dietary ingredient guidance does is it causes the FDA to take a part of the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act that I hated, didn't want to be a part of. There are many parts that I didn't like. This part I really didn't like. And they take this part and they define what a new dietary ingredient is. A new dietary ingredient under the Act is illegal to sell because it's presumed adulterated, unless you meet an exception. And the first exception is that you show that the dietary ingredient had been marketed before October 15, 1994 as a dietary supplement. The second exception is that you show the dietary ingredient was included in foods and had not been chemically altered from the state that existed in the food. Then if you meet one of these exceptions, you will not be considered a new dietary ingredient. But if you don't meet these exceptions, then you will if you were a substance first introduced after October 15, 1994. So the FDA realizes that there are only a small number of products that have been introduced after October 15, 1994, but they can take that term chemically altered and they can reconstrue its meaning so that almost everything that is processed through a modern system of extraction will be deemed chemically altered. It doesn't have to be a different chemical. They say the process can chemically alter it in the meaning of the statute as we define it if you use a process that didn't exist before October 15, 1994. So all of these processes that have been developed that ensure the purity of ingredients that didn't exist before 94 and that are routinely used in the industry now become illegal. This is one aspect of the change in definitions that have taken place in this rule. When this rule is fully implemented, half of the dietary supplements that are on the market will be deemed to contain new dietary ingredients. Half of the dietary supplements that are safely consumed and have been consumed safely for over a decade, and some for hundreds or thousands of years, will be taken off the market without any proof of an adverse effect, without any proof that anyone was ever injured by it, because of this gameplay with the language. Why is it happening? Very simple again. Because the dietary supplement industry is not the master of its own ship. The ship, which is not unlike Carnival Cruise Line, it really is like that. The ship is run by the drug industry. And the dietary supplement industry is just one hapless passenger on that unfortunate ship. So that is what's happening with the dietary supplement industry and the way back to liberty. Now, these are principles that I hold, that I hope you too hold. These are beliefs that I believe in.
Is this on your website?
This is not on my website, but there is a handout at our booth. These are the basic beliefs that support the Constitution. I believe in the Constitution. I believe in individual liberty. I believe in these principles. And these are resolutions that I believe in. These are actions that I think I need to take because of these beliefs. I challenge you to look at this. And if you share with me these commitments and you have this resolution, I want you to join me in a national campaign. Now, for many years you've asked me, hey, you say these things and they're horrible, and I leave here feeling terrible, and I want to know what I can do. I love my country. What can I do? And I've pondered about that. And I've tried to come up with a resolution for you. And I think I have something that can work. I'm going to come up, well, it's going to be out in April. It's an e-newsletter, and it's going to be interactive. And what we're going to do with this e-newsletter, constitutional lawyers on my staff, other contributors that I'm bringing together, we're going to identify specifically the constitutional violations that take place from this government. We're going to identify the corruption. We're going to identify the abuse of power. We're specifically going to document it. And then we're going to invite specific actions on your part, joining us to try to influence the political process to change it. At worst, we'll be loud. And at best, we'll become effective. And I want to engage in this campaign. If we don't do this together, if we don't commence a national movement to change this law as it's evolving to destroy this country, we will witness the destruction of the United States, in fact. and we will witness a loss of all of our liberties, in fact. And we will have an opportunity to create a new government, I suppose, but we are heading to destruction. Liberal economists and conservative economists are in agreement on this one point. Federal spending and the growth of the federal government is unsustainable. And yet, even though we are in the midst of a crisis, where we have less than 10 years before we witness the collapse of these massive welfare systems, the government shows no sense of urgency. The president doesn't even offer a balanced budget. He doesn't even offer a program that will reduce federal spending more than $400 billion a year, when the increase in federal spending beyond our receipts is $1.3 billion and escalating every year. There is no sense of urgency. There is no sense of the immediate crisis that is here. And so what this will enable us to do is to work together peaceably to transform this government and to put a jolt of electricity under the behinds of those people who are in elected office, to realize that there is anger, there is interest in protecting our rights, that we're not going to lie down and take this, that we are insisting on specific reforms to this government, and that our voices will become louder and louder and louder as this continuing crisis continues. That's a basic template of what the site will look like. It's still under construction, but we're going to have a lot more information, and the information will tell us what we need to do. Here is the latest book. It documents all of the abuses which we've discussed today, plus more. And the critical factor for us as a people, there are three things we need to do. We need to become educated about the actual instances of corruption, abuse of power, and constitutional violation that is taking place. That's what this e-newsletter will do. It's at restoretherepublic.co, and it becomes live on April 1st. And you can subscribe to it downstairs, $15 a year. It's a monthly thing. The other thing, so educate. We read the books, we learn the information, we get all this information from the website. The second thing we need to do is to join together with family members and others in appreciating the significance of this information. We need to invite others to understand how weighty it is, the destruction of our liberties. And then the third thing we need to do is to act. And we need a vehicle to act. And we need to be able to act together in a coordinated fashion. And that's what this e-newsletter will do. We're advertising this massively. We're going to be on George Norrie's show. We'll reach 20 million people next month, inviting them all to join us. We need everybody here who's spirited and in defense of liberty to take up this cause and participate in it. You asked me what I should do. You've repeatedly asked me how I would structure this. I think this is the way to do it. We have no significance as an individual voice. We only have significance if politicians begin to regard us as a force to be reckoned with and appreciate that our numbers consistently grow. We're going to work with you to make that happen. Now, I don't know, do I have any time left for questions?
Yeah, go
Say
ahead.
yes, 5 minutes.
Sure. I'll stop recording in
5 minutes?
3 minutes. 3 minutes.
3 minutes, all
But
right.
you can do 5 minutes.
Right.
Your speech is the best speech I've ever heard in my 75 years. In 1967, when Abba Eban went on TV to defend Israel's war against the Palestinians. This was
Thank you.
absolutely fantastic.
Hey, tell Glenn to put me on. All right. Yes, sir.
I know you have a successful track record as the FDA, but I'd like to get your feedback with that track record on what you think of the decision tossing out the basic foreign drugs and sanity.
Well, sadly, I anticipated that that would be the result because they lack basically, I think the homework necessary to bring the suit properly was not done. And so, while the cause is right, my heart is with it. Unfortunately, the technique used was the wrong vehicle to get an answer to that problem. So it was not something that surprised me at all. Raw milk, thank you. Raw milk, this is another example of government tyranny. I mean, yes, raw milk may contain pathogens. So do raw oysters, so does sushi, so does steak tartare, so does chicken, so do eggs. I mean, these things are capable of causing injury, causing you to suffer from pathogens that may infect them. And much depends upon the care in processing this stuff. And you can do something, the government has this draconian approach of banning interstate distribution of raw milk, totally banning it to try to completely destroy raw milk. There is an alternative to this approach of complete destruction, and it's used all the time, and that's a warning statement. Why not simply put a warning statement on raw milk that says, raw milk may contain pathogens. If you wish to diminish to the greatest extent possible your risk of having a pathogenic infection, cook the milk at 250 degrees for 2 minutes. I mean, why deny people the right of access to raw milk? I mean, it's so ridiculous. You have people becoming sick from raw oysters, from all sorts of things, from pasteurized milk. And yet, you focus your attention with this sledgehammer on Amish farmers. You take a lifestyle that's known in the Mexican community and the Amish community, has been known for, Jesus Christ drank raw milk. I mean, this has been known forever. And it's been a cultural characteristic. All the founding fathers drank raw milk. This is a part of our history. And it's freedom of choice. We accept risks. Do we want to live in a rubber room society where the rubber is paid for by us? The federal government polices it so that we don't walk across the street because there may be a chance that you could be hit by an automobile, where we don't enter into a car unless it's driven by a federal agent, where we don't, I mean, how far do you go? This is ridiculous. Yeah.
I want to make a point that more people have died from cooked hamburger than raw milk by a factor of over 1,000.
Thank you very much. Raw milk has nutrients in it that you don't get from pasteurized milk. That's true. Sir, right back there.
What do you think about the petition to the president to terminate Michael Taylor, a former Monsanto vice president, as the senior advisor to the commissioner of the FDA?
It's an outrage that Taylor is a senior advisor to the FDA. His involvement with Monsanto, the whole insidious relationship that he had with them, and then with the whole issue of regulation, shows that there were conflicts of interest. He was sent to the Department of Agriculture because of the conflicts of interest at FDA at the time, the controversy over it. Then suddenly the Obama administration, which prides itself on eliminating conflicts of interest, takes him back and puts him right back next to the commissioner at the FDA. It's an outrage. He should go.
Hamburger's already said she doesn't believe in conflict of interest.
Exactly. That's right.